Luke 2, verses 6 and 7. Now it happened that while they were there, the days were completed for her child to be born. And she gave birth to her firstborn son. And she wrapped him in swaddling cloths and laid him in the manger, because there was no room for them in the inn. Father Lawrence says it may be asked why Mary accompanied Joseph during his journey to Bethlehem, especially since she was so far advanced in her pregnancy. No one can say with certainty. It is possible that as a subject who was liable to pay the poll tax in Syria, women were thus liable, Mary was legally required to appear and be registered too. But it is possible that she accompanied Joseph because it was too socially difficult for her to be left alone without him in her native Nazareth. Being found pregnant prior to marriage may well have had disastrous social implications for her, leaving her ostracized by all in the town. Now, St. Bede makes a note about the use of the word firstborn here. Mary gives birth to her firstborn son. And St. Bede writes, he calls the Lord firstborn not because we should believe that Mary gave birth to other sons after him, since it is true that she was memorable for her unique perpetual chastity with Joseph, her husband. But he properly names him firstborn because, as John says, but to as many as received him, he gave them the power to become sons of God, John 1:12. Among these sons, he rightfully holds the primacy, who before he was born in the flesh was Son of God, born without beginning. He can be called the firstborn because everybody who believes in him becomes also sons of God and becomes an inheritor of the Father's bounties. And so because we are all sons of God through him, he is the firstborn. The Orthodox Study Bible says the term firstborn does not imply Mary had additional children, but only that no child was born before Jesus. The firstborn son is traditionally the primary heir and recipient of blessings. Christ is the firstborn over all creation, and thus the firstborn from the dead, Colossians 1:15 and 18. And Father Lawrence again offers us some deeper detail into this title, firstborn. He has called her firstborn, Greek prototokos. Remember, Mary, the mother of God in Greek is Theotokos, so he is prototokos. Not because Mary would later have other children, but because of the status of the firstborn son in Judaism. The firstborn male was the head of the family and inherited a double share of the ancestral property. He was also thought of as belonging to God in a special way. The firstborn son would thus be so called even if he were an only child. Luke describes Jesus as the firstborn son in order to prepare us for the story of Mary's presence in the temple, where she would meet Simeon. And this is Luke 2:22 and on. For the sacrifices she had to offer there were only offered after the birth of the firstborn male. So it's not necessarily firstborn of many, but it is a title which had specific social implications in the culture at the time. And then we look at the swaddling cloths. The child is wrapped in swaddling cloths. In the Orthodox icons of the Nativity, the Orthodox Study Bible notes, Christ's swaddling cloths are depicted as burial wrappings, affirming that one purpose of his coming was to endure death. The manger or feed trough would have been in a cave where animals were kept, thus fulfilling the prophecy of Isaiah, the ox knows its owner and the donkey its master's crib. Father Thomas Hopko says that Jesus is the only human being ever born whose calling was to die. We all die, but that's why he came into the world, was specifically to die for us so that we might have life. Now, one other thing here, when it talks about the inn, there's no room at the inn. The word inn here does not really mean a hotel like we would think of it today, or like we sometimes see in movies where there's a pub on a main floor and then there's these rooms where you can sleep on floors above it, because the word implies something that's more like a shelter or a hostel where people could stay for free. It usually was just one big room where everybody was staying together, so it was not particularly private. It was not particularly well appointed. And so we have this sense that Christ enters into the world in this condition of lowliness and poverty, and that this is an important part of the nativity story. St. John Chrysostom says that he was born in a public place and in a memorable way. St. John writes that his birth might be made manifest and become common knowledge, he was laid in a manger. not in some small room, but in a lodging place before numerous people. So that when they spoke about these things, people would say, oh yes, we remember that, the child that was born in this manger in an inn. So he was born in this public place. St. Ambrose of Milan, quoting 2 Corinthians 8, Paul writes, he being rich became poor for our sakes, that through his poverty you might be rich. St. Ambrose says, therefore his poverty is our inheritance, and the Lord's weakness is our virtue. St. Bede writes, he who sits at the right hand of the Father goes without shelter from the inn, that he may for us get ready many mansions in the house of his heavenly Father. So again, we see these rhythmic patterns and how God works our salvation, and this particular pattern, again, being an opposing pattern of Christ descending into our poverty so that we may rise with him into the riches of the heavenly kingdom. Then Father Lawrence writes about this idea about there being no room at the inn. And he says, Luke's recording of this detail is not accidental, for it foreshadows the future rejection of Jesus by his people. There was no room for him in the lodging place when the time came for him to be born, just as there was no room for him in the hearts of his people when the time came for them to acknowledge him as the Messiah.